Establishment media in the U.S. is admonishing us. Think of the children! But are they? And in what way exactly? Opponents of the current U.S. president's immigration policies are very, very terribly, really awfully concerned about the separation of families crossing the U.S.-Mexico border illegally. The hand-wringing on this topic is quite understandable, considering the media reports coming out indicating that thousands upon thousands of little kids are being ripped away from loving mothers and fathers without any reason for long-term incarceration in dog cages within concentration camps in our very own U.S. version of a Holocaust. Even worse, according to the establishment media, President Trump has single-handedly written and enacted a new, never-before-existing policy that labels every foreign national crossing the border an illegal immigrant, so even families entering the nation legally are being ripped apart. This action has drawn bipartisan criticism from not only political commentators but also legislators who are quite vocal about it, yet mysteriously unwilling to take any action to reform it. Never before has such an egregious policy existed in the United States, not one that would do something so awful as to separate children from their families, or parents from their children. How could something like the current immigrant family situation happen in the land of the free? Oh wait, it's not. At least not to foreign nationals, and not as it's being described by establishment media. Yes, separation is happening, and the separation that is happening is bad. Nearly everyone is rightfully upset about it. It shouldn't be happening, and the policy that has led to it is awful and absolutely needs to be reformed, scrapped, and replaced with something that actually addresses the current pattern of migration and the needs of both this nation and those seeking refuge here. And yes, President Trump is handling this policy differently than President Obama did. Neither one of their positions on it has created a desirable outcome for the United States or for immigrants. Thanks to establishment media, however, nearly everyone is also terribly misinformed about the situation. No, this isn't a totally Trump gig. It's not even entirely due to presidential policy at all, but a result of U.S. courts ruling on the Obama administration's housing of illegal immigrant families in detention shelters under Bush-era law and policy. No, these families are not being routinely subjected to long-term separation, and no, the existing situation is not due to Trump policy labeling all families crossing the border illegal. The Department of Homeland Security's June 18th press release states the following: DHS will separate adults and minors under certain circumstances. These circumstances include 1. When DHS is unable to determine the familial relationship, 2. When DHS determines that a child may be at risk with the parent or legal guardian, or 3. When the parent or legal guardian is referred for criminal prosecution. The statement goes on to describe suspicion of human trafficking, smuggling, or safety risks such as suspected child abuse as reasons for separating minors from adults with whom they are traveling. Families cannot be held indefinitely because of the Flores Settlement Agreement, which stipulates the government is required to release children from immigration detention without unnecessary delay to, in order of preference, parents, other adult relatives, or licensed programs willing to accept custody. If a suitable placement is not immediately available, the government is obligated to place children in the least restrictive setting appropriate to their age and any special needs. The government must implement standards related to the care and treatment of children in immigration detention. What does this mean? It means that there's a limit to how long kids can be detained, and that whenever possible, they are released to their own parents or family, only becoming wards of the state when that is not possible. When it happens, law and policy requires they receive age and need-appropriate housing and care. In response, the Obama administration closed centers that housed families together and released illegal immigrant families into the United States, referring them to civil deportation proceedings, for which many naturally never showed up, Trump's alternative has been to instead enforce existing law that the Obama administration let slide, resulting in the detainment of adults who cross the border illegally, whether they are accompanied by minors or not, and that resulting in the accompanying minors becoming temporarily wards of the state. Meanwhile, DHS Secretary Nielsen has, as Breitbart put it, begged foreign asylum seekers to please come to the ports of entry on the U.S.-Mexico border rather than attempting to sneak in illegally. Individuals seeking entry through legal means via the designated ports of entry are not considered illegal immigrants, and policy has not labeled them as such. Political commentators who have been claiming that all foreign nationals attempting to cross the border have been deemed illegal are not only lying, but doing so in a way that may frighten prospective immigrants away from ports of entry, damaging their chances of achieving legally protected status they may otherwise deserve. No, there are not thousands upon thousands of kids being separated from their parents at the border. Nielsen informed the public in a press conference on June 18th that the vast majority of children who are in the care of HHS right now, 10,000 of the 12,000, were sent here alone by their parents. However, Nielsen's accusation against migrant minors' parents is not entirely accurate either. While that majority, 10,000 according to DHS, does arrive without actual family, they are not necessarily arriving alone, and were not necessarily all sent voluntarily by their parents. According to a report by Laura Ingram that same day, children have been kidnapped, trafficked, and used by individuals who can then more easily slip into the country. In other words, the conflict between existing policy in the courts, which resulted during the Obama administration in the release of, quote, families into the general population on their promise to attend a hearing, made being accompanied by one or more children a working strategy for gaining entry into the U.S. when one otherwise might not be able. Then, as stated in Ingram's report, Obama's 2012 DACA policy increased the lure of trafficking children across the border, and therefore the number of children being kidnapped and used by those willing to exploit them to gain entry into the United States, or for labor and sexual exploitation. These policies tripled the number of minors unaccompanied by family attempting to cross the U.S. border between 2012 and 2017. Breitbart reports that to combat this exploitation, Attorney General Jeff Sessions is discussing with Congress the use of DNA tests at the border to confirm biological relationships between immigrant children and their parents. Donald Trump's response to this situation, which has resulted in parents and children being housed separately while their cases and claims are evaluated, is certainly not a policy that should be maintained for the long term, but it is hardly the unilateral dramatic policy change the media has made it out to be. No, a Holocaust is not being carried out against immigrants into the United States. Neither children nor adults are being incarcerated in dog cages, nor are migrants being held in concentration camps. Rather, media outlets and political commentators are describing chain-link fencing around long-standing immigration detention shelters, also used as a divider within some buildings, as dog cages. They're describing detention shelters that have existed through 2 or more administrations with little or no media protest as concentration camps. Temporary housing of migrants who traveled under their own power to the nation where they are being detained is wrongly being given the same label as the systematic forced rounding up, enslavement, torture, and murder of entire populations during World War II. That terminology is not just inaccurate. It is deliberately misleading, designed for emotional manipulation, and it is a slap in the faces of actual Holocaust victims and their families, one that does no more good for migrant families than the crocodile tears of television anchors or the hypocritical representatives exploiting it as political fodder. Again, this is not an expression of approval for the policy itself. This should never have happened. It's heartless and disgusting that all of the politicians involved are using the situation for political posturing rather than coming together to compose and enact a policy that would allow border agents to do their jobs without either traumatizing families or facilitating child exploitation and trafficking. Donald Trump is neither innocent of that nor the only guilty politician. This is on everyone in Washington and everyone in the mainstream media, half of which are more interested in using this as a bludgeon against the president than accurately reporting on it, and the other half of which are engaging in as much damage control as myth-busting. Meanwhile, both groups are discussing this issue as if the United States government does not make a habit of separating children from their parents every day. I'm not just talking about the incarcerated, who have been brought up by right-wing media only to be immediately dismissed by the left. Their situation is at least similar to that of migrants. They're being separated from their children following an illegal act, for which they have been detained and are later incarcerated. To both the left, who suddenly discovered the horrors of forcibly broken families in response to the migrant situation, and to the right, who have suddenly discovered that incarcerated parents, while forgetting that most of them are fathers, are also forcibly separated from their children, my first question is, where the hell have you guys been all of these years? Are you really unaware of the scope and magnitude of this phenomenon? Are you unaware of the abuses of the juvenile criminal law and detention system? How about I lay down a few facts for your edification? While pundits whine about a policy change that has resulted in the short-term separation of families under evaluation by DHS, the U.S. justice system has been routinely separating vulnerable youth from their families for decades. And like the migrant children for whom such outrage has been expressed, they are not heading for summer camp. We reported on the school-to-prison pipeline in Less Equal Accountability Gap Enabled, HBR Talk 28. We pointed out failure to properly provide special education services leading to wrongful incarceration of intellectually disabled youth. As I reminded listeners in that report, Justice Bureau statistics show that 95% of incarcerated youth are boys. Once incarcerated, they face conditions that put them at higher risk for recidivism and a return to incarceration each time they are released. Not only are these kids being separated from their parents, they're being housed in institutions where many of them experience significant abuse, including solitary confinement, as reported by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and sexual exploitation of mostly male inmates by mostly female staff, as reported by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. This information is publicly available, yet has generated little outrage among political pundits outside the men's rights movement, and much less from any politicians. Neither has the fact that many of the kids in these facilities are not there because they are willfully bad. They're in corrective facilities because the systems children must depend on to help them grow and develop have at some point failed them. Similarly, our family court system routinely separates or facilitates the separation of children from their fathers, both through unequal custody assignments and lack of enforcement for the little amount of time that is allotted to non-custodial fathers. In the United States, custody is awarded to mothers over 80% of the time. Fathers are more likely to face child support obligations, and the obligations imposed on them are more likely to be inconsistent with their ability to pay, resulting in their being incarcerated and, as a result, prevented from maintaining much, if any, of a relationship with their children. Children's relationships with their fathers are vital, every bit as important as their relationships with their mothers. Father involvement influences a child's social and psychological development in a variety of ways, as explained by Sarah Allen, MSc, and Carrie Daly, PhD, in their report The Effects of Father Involvement, a summary of the research evidence. Kids denied that relationship have increased likelihood of undesirable outcomes like becoming unwed parents themselves, engaging in criminal offense, living in poverty, and ending up welfare dependent. Efforts at reforming family law to prevent children from being denied relationships with their fathers have been largely stymied by opposition from groups like the National Organization for Women, who respond to equally shared parenting legislation by submitting arguments to legislative bodies considering it, demonizing fathers in general as deadbeats and abusers. Now has repeatedly been successful in preventing the legal protection of American children's access to their fathers. The lack of establishment media outrage over this phenomenon manifests in a deafening silence. Our government even has an agency created mainly for the purpose of separating select American children from their families. Child Protective Services, which exists purportedly for the rescue of abused or neglected children, has been repeatedly, even routinely exposed for decades for their habit of dramatically overzealous removal of children from their parents' homes, their actions often protected by court-ordered silence and secrecy in individual cases. This phenomenon is a result of the combined mechanisms of two laws. both of which financially incentivize the removal of children from their family homes and their subsequent placement for adoption. Widespread media outrage? Don't count on it. This doesn't even seem to merit their attention at all. This is not to suggest that there should be any less sympathy for immigrant children because of the experiences of U.S. youth in juvenile detention, divorced families, or the Child Protective System, but that much of the public expression of such sympathy by politicians and the media is suspiciously selective. Where were the sobbing television news anchors as information regarding the separation of American children from their parents emerged? Do they just not care because these kids' situations don't help them to promote a particular narrative? Are legislators unsympathetic because of their own involvement in the legislation and policy causing these problems? Is the public outrage of political pundits reserved only for abuses against foreign nationals? Or is it perhaps exaggerated or even manufactured for political effect? Perhaps it is time for citizens to cast off talking heads' manipulative control and examine these issues from a more rational standpoint. Unnecessary division of families is wrong, but it's not just wrong under certain circumstances. It's not just wrong when it affects select populations or when it's politically expedient to pay attention to it. We should be able to recognize that a policy is doing harm to individuals and groups within the population without letting emotional response distract us from fighting for effective, practical reform. Will our response to this situation be informed by political tribalism? Or are we strong enough and smart enough to base it on human rights considerations, recognition of human nature, practical compassion, and a healthy dose of uncompromising realism? Only time and the political actions we as a population choose to condone will tell.